Frederick, that's a really nice photo.
Thank you. It's from a hike I did last fall in the lower mountains here in Sweden. So it was a amazing day. Like the weather was unreal.
Yeah, I don't have that in the Hudson Valley in New York.
Oh yeah.
We have lots of trees, but not landscape like this.
Yeah, no, it's one of the perks. I think it's that the place is 4 hours away from where I live, so it's fairly easy to get there by car, which is nice.
Yeah. It's more like it.
Give it a couple minutes and then get out.
We'll give it a couple minutes and then get started here. While we're waiting for anybody else to join, feel free to add your attendance and any agenda items to the meeting. All right, we can probably get started. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded. It'll be uploaded to YouTube shortly after, and your participation in this meeting is an agreement to abide by the OpenSSF Code of Conduct. All right. So looks like we don't have much on the agenda for today, but if folks have stuff, feel free to add it, or we can bring it just up in discussion. The only topic I had for this week was other than just sort of general like 1.0 stuff was Open Source North America is next week. I don't know who on this call, if anybody is going, but if folks are going to be out at Open Source Summit North America, I'll be out there. There's going to be a handful of salsa talks. There's going to be a salsa panel that I'm on, as well as I'll be giving a talk just generally on like how to get started with Salsa, I'll probably be just using the GitHub action for Salsa, while also maybe pointing folks in the direction of a couple of other tools for Salsa as well. Yeah, for folks who will be there. Okay, see Brendan Mitchell mentioned that he's going to be there. Hope to see you there in person. Yeah, and if there's any other talks that folks are aware of that seem good, feel free to put it into the docs. Sorry, put it into the meeting notes here, or bring it up now. And I see for anybody who's joining now, feel free to put your attendance in the meeting notes. Hi Amanda, is this your first time attending the tooling meeting?
Yeah, this is the first one I've been to. I'm the director of program management at the Linux Foundation and starting to help with OpenSSF for the last month or so. And so I'm just popping into occasional working groups and SIGs to see if there's anything I should jump in on and things like that.
Cool. Glad to have your support. Cool. So give me 1 second here. Okay, looks like there's a talk on NPM Providence from folks at GitHub and NPM. So Trevor and Zach.
Yeah,
that sounds. Yep, cool.
Both of them are from my team. So
yeah, yep. Awesome. Looking forward to that one. All right. There's okay. So it looks like it looks like a couple of us are heading out there. All right. So next up on the agenda is the GitLab NPM Providence in progress. Frederick,
yeah,
do you have details on that one?
Yeah, I think it's more for your information. Like it won't be massively different from the work we did for provenance generation in GitHub Action Runners. It's pretty much the same story, but for GitLab runners, or GitLab pipelines, maybe it's called. But I just want to make sure everyone knows that the work is happening. So I mean, it has never been the idea that provenance for NPM should be exclusive, and GitHub Actions, we are happy to welcome as many cloud providers as we can. So we're excited to see that GitLab is getting there. And it's still Salsa v02 provenance for GitLab. It's not 1.1.0.
Okay, cool. Cool. Awesome. Yeah, it's good stuff. Do you know if there's because I know with the RFC that had gone out regarding the provenance and everything else, do you know where there's like guidance on this provenance generation, like anything that folks would like? Let's say I don't know, just gonna throw a company out there like Circle CI is like, hey, now we want to be involved. What is sort of what do folks need to start doing in order to?
Yeah, good question. I think the best guide we have would actually be how they would be integrated with Fulcio, because in the end of the day, I think that's the biggest adoption blocker, or it could be the biggest adoption blocker. And as part of getting the CI provider onto Fulcio, you usually have to, or you have to meet some certain requirements, which are typically the requirements we are interested in, such as like identifying the identity of the builder, or the Git commit the build is coming from, the workflow or orb or whatever is called in Circle that is being used to build the artifact, etc. So usually a provider that is capable of integrating with Fulcio would probably meet the requirements we have for being integrated. And then of course the rest would be around the actual provenance generation itself, which typically is something you will do, let's say, on top of the runner itself, because that's how we're doing it with GitHub Action and GitLab, and then of course with the SLSA GitHub generator, which is also a component on top of the CI platform itself.
Cool.
I can try to find a link to the Fulcio sort of requirements to be integrated with that. So just give me a few seconds.
Yeah, no, that's awesome though. Yeah. I know, and this is some of the stuff that I know we've talked about in a couple of the other meetings, has been just like folks are starting to ask like a lot of questions about what's required by who to do what when it comes to all these different things that are kind of coming out. And then in addition to that, other ecosystems are like, hey, maybe we should adopt sort of similar practices. And some of those ecosystems, right, like some of them, it's going to be a little bit easier than others, right? Because some of those ecosystems, the majority of builds are perhaps happening within, you know, some giant enterprises CI, compared to like NPM, which I think the vast majority of NPM packages are being built out in the open. So saying, hey, you need to build this out in the open on one of n number of hosted providers that all at least provide for open source some sort of free tier, I think is fine. I think just trying to kind of understand, you know, for some of these other ecosystems, as well as some of the folks who are starting to, like, this is, I think, a separate problem, which is the like, hey, you know, folks on my end are asking like, hey, what I do is like, I'm a B2B software, like I don't publish any of this stuff to public, but how do I, like, I have a tool that generates SLSA modules, you know, or sorry, rather SLSA provenance against some packages. I distribute those packages in a sort of closed ecosystem, B2B. How do I, you know, also go out and how do I provide that while also asserting that I am SLSA compliant more publicly, though, so that folks know, oh, you go and you buy my software, I'm generating SLSA conformant software, which I know is I think we had talked about that also a little bit last week as well, which is, you know.
Yeah, just one thing. I'm not sure if this is commonly known, like it is public information, but for NPM provenance, we do not accept any provenance statement that is not built on public or cloud infrastructure. Like if you're building on your local desktop or whatever private runner you're running in your company's infrastructure, we will not accept that. So it has to be from a public CI provider.
Yeah. No, and I think so. I totally agree with that, and I totally agree with open source ecosystems taking that stance. I think the question that has come up is, and it's not so much a question for the tools themselves, other than the tools should help promote easy, you know, whatever, is, you know, if I'm somebody who just, you know, I'm not providing stuff to NPM, I'm selling my own, you know, whatever it is. One of the things was just like, how do I provide provenance and also make an assertion that I am providing salsa conformant provenance that complies with like, Linux Foundation trademarks and yada yada. How do I do that without being, let's say, building out in the public, that kind of thing?
So, so Michael, I'm not sure if this answers your question, but I'd always imagined that like this is one of the primary motivators for using the VSA, where like a provider could build the software, verify it against whatever policy they want, and then they can use the VSA as a statement that says this software with this hash, with this package name, meets this salsa level according to some authority, which might even just be like our internal salsa policy engine.
Oh yeah. So I think there's a couple of different separate problems, and I think like 80% of the problem is more on the specification and positioning side, and 20% of the problem is how do we actually implement it via the tools. But I think the open question, so as I mentioned, for folks who weren't in some of the other meetings, pretty much one of the biggest pieces of feedback I got when at KubeCon EU, after the announcement, a lot of folks were super excited. But one of the consistent pieces of feedback was a lot of folks were like, they're looking at the NPM stuff as if it's the only thing, right? Like they're saying like, oh, wait a second, is everything supposed to be open source, or is salsa only for like SaaS? And I'm like, no, that's not the case. For certain ecosystems where they like, you could imagine, right? There could be like a Linux Foundation build system for Linux Foundation projects, right? Like that, that they hosted their own thing and said, we're going to host our own thing. And you might say, great, they get into Falsio, everything's good. I think there's just some open questions from folks just sort of generally like, hey, I'm not sure if is salsa primarily an open source only thing? Is it primarily a SaaS only thing? And those things are not the case. It just, the focus has been on some of these open source use cases because of how easy it is, and also the mission of groups like OpenSSF is primarily in that open source space. But I know as we try to get wider industry adoption, there's some open questions about how do we better communicate some of that out. Once again, I don't think the communication is really the responsibility of this particular meeting group, but I do think when it comes to some of the tooling, right? Like if there's I know that there's the Oracle test, or the Oracle lab group created a project called Macaron, which I know is in the list of things inside of the tools here. I think it's from a couple of weeks ago. But Macaron is like a way of like, hey, I can go and essentially do a bunch of investigation into your infrastructure and whatever else and say, yep, I took a look at, I don't think they support this yet, but the idea there being, hey, I took a look at your Terraform and I noticed that your Terraform seems to spin up a build system that is, relatively secure. You might need to have some additional human attestation or human assertions on top of that. But basically, I think that's kind of where folks are sort of interested, because when they start to go and say, okay, great, I'm not providing software in the open source, but I still want to use salsa. How do I do that?
So my reflection on that would be like, I think part of the confusion might be that a lot of the fuss is around various open source projects or tools around salsa, because it's super easy to blog about what you're doing for open source, whereas I don't think a lot of companies are blogging about their internal salsa uses. But I'm just thinking, could we kind of reach out to certain companies that we know are using salsa to make like a case study blog or something like that to kind of show to the rest of the community that this is definitely something that's valid for companies that only produces source code or artifacts for themselves, and they can tie it to, let's say, an admission controller to making sure that whatever workload they are running is being built by their approved builders, etc. Because I do know companies are doing that.
Yeah, so I could reach out to one company on my end that I know is doing some stuff there. I don't know if they'll make it public, but I can definitely check with them. It's a hedge fund that is looking to, you know, build all their software SLSA, where they give it to sort of partner folks. Cool. Yep, and then I think the rest of the concerns seem to be more from like a documentation and other blogging sort of standpoint of like, yeah, when most of the examples that people are talking about are all the open source or all the SaaS, like, yeah, I use GitHub Actions for this, or I use or you know, here's how I took this CNCF project, like the public CNCF audit on Prometheus and what was the other one? Argo, I think, on SLSA. It's like, hey, that's great. Is it mostly a, you know, there was some confusion on it being public versus, or it being primarily like a SaaS open source sort of thing. Separately, I know that the conformance program, I have some comments out there on that to sort of make sure that folks recognize that the idea here is not to purely support one or the other. The idea is to say, hey, this is one of the first frameworks that can support a SaaS quite easily, right? Which I think is super important. A lot of folks sort of assumed you had to control everything from source to the actual package release, which has been the case for most sorts of these kinds of frameworks for years and years and years. But now that you could split that up, you can say, hey, I outsourced my storage to GitHub, like to the code, but I have my own internal runners because I have some special use case or whatever. Or, you know, I publish to, you know, a SaaS artifact repository, but everything else is internal or whatever. Like this, I think there's a lot of great stuff on that end. I just think that, yeah, when it comes to some of the other pieces, I think when it comes to like self-hosted and yada yada, a lot of folks are asking a lot of good questions, but they're not sure. And then in addition to that, I think with the conformance thing, they're a little unsure of how to claim they are SLSA without, you know, running afoul of Linux Foundation lawyers, which I know, just to be clear, I know in general, they only go after folks who are egregiously being like, oh, we're, you know, we're sponsored by the Linux Foundation or whatever, you know, trying to make an illegitimate connection. But I know that a lot of folks are like, hey, how do I say I'm SLSA without, you know, ostensibly lying to people? How do I kind of get that badge and say, yep, I spoke to all the right people, I did all the right things, and I am, you know, my build system is SLSA compliant.
So, so Michael, along those lines, is there a difference? Is there a difference between like statements that you might make on a web page, like a badge that you list, and like versus you know, any of the metadata that you might produce and release, which sort of necessarily lists SLSA? Like I'm thinking about the VSA, where like
Yeah.
the data format has like this particular SLSA level in it. What I don't recall is like if the VSA format says anything like, hey, this is just our opinion, man.
Yeah.
You know, this is not necessarily endorsed by the OpenSSF.
So I think the thing that's coming out of it is, so I've spoken to some companies, and some of the companies do want to, for example, say they want to come out and say, we want to be able to tell our customers we have followed the SLSA, you know, not just generating SLSA, you know, generating SLSA provenance, but we want to be able to go out and say that. And I know with the conformance program, there's a combination of a self-attestation or a self-audit or whatever. You can write a statement on that. And then, you know, separately for companies that are maybe a bit more, and at the end of the day, it's always going to be me as the user. Do I trust this company? Sure. But I know that when it comes to also the dilution of the brand a little bit, I know the Linux Foundation and OpenSSF has said, hey, we've already had a couple of cases where a few companies have said like, we're SLSA 4+. And they're like, what? Like, that's not a thing. And they start to and you start to ask them like, how are they achieving SLSA? And they start to go and say, well, we're doing, it's like, oh, so you're kind of taking our brand and by our, I just mean the Linux Foundation's brand, and you're sort of making a claim without like, there's nothing really to back that up, and you have enough of those blog articles, and folks get very confused, because even with the SLSA 1.0 release, there were a couple of articles that I don't know if everybody saw, but there were a couple of articles that had gone out where some folks had gotten kind of confused. They still thought that they were 4 SLSA levels, still looking at the old version. There was a lot of stuff like that, hey, if we can have something that's a conformance program that is pretty, rigorous and whatever, it's like, yes, if I am just like a small company, I can't pay for an audit, that's fine. I can just say, here's what I'm doing. Here's my whole setup, and also try and make it as easy as possible for them to make those claims. And here's what I'm doing, because especially for, I think the majority of software using GitLab, GitHub Actions, Circle CI, and whatever is going to fit, the average use case. But I know with a lot of folks, especially in the fintech space, one of the big things is like, hey, I want to run a build in a hyper private sort of, setup, which is also why I know last week we were talking about some of the stuff with Project Oak, and how some people are starting to look at, myself included, and some other folks are starting to look at stuff like, could you run a SLSA build inside of a trusted enclave or trusted execution environment? And that sort of thing, where you could start to say, hey, where the hardware, like what is actually running this, is a little less important, as long as it's running it on something that is compliant with, some sort of hardware, security standard. But anyway, that's much further along. But yeah, I think the basic idea is just trying to figure out, like, also to take a step back, it's about like who is making what claim and how and in what cases. I think is just trying to figure out how to make that clearer to both the folks who are making those claims as well as the folks who are intended to consume those claims. Is useful, because I know a lot of it's, and to be clear, it's still very early, but there's a lot of confusion right now around, because a couple of folks from KubeCon were like, hey, does SLSA support Jenkins? Because I only see like GitHub Actions, or is it just like a GitHub Actions thing? Like, no. It just so happened that the tools to write for this GitHub Actions is just super easy, compared to doing it first for Jenkins, which is a separate problem, which Jenkins tends to be very open and yada yada. But I think kind of some of the stuff for this group, I think, is how can we start to make some of those tools to make, and potentially, this is some of the stuff that we talked about last week for anybody who wasn't here, was like, maybe we need to start making the tools that making the tools easier, right? Like, are there things we can do from a library perspective or whatever, so that folks who are coming in and saying, yeah, I want to make a Haskell SLSA builder, what would that look like, right? Something like that. And I know I ranted on for a while. To be clear, I think it's just, everything in SLSA I think is great. I just think that there's a lot of still confusion, and somebody else, I think, in the positioning group brought up webinars. I think it might have actually been Brian Bellendorf himself brought up webinars with the tools. Like, if folks have SLSA tools, maybe we can give an hour-and-a-half webinar kind of thing, and just show off, like, here is the GitHub action, here is how folks have done it with Tecton and Tecton Chains or Fresca or whatever. Here's some of the other tools that are coming out, and something like that might prove to be useful. So, are there any other topics that folks have? I have one minor one, but I was going to wait to see if anybody else has anything.
I just have more kind of a landscape question. So because I interested in this topic, so I actually listened to some of the earlier supply chain videos back in 2021 and 22. One thing actually I think you said is actually SLSA is actually a kind of implementation of in total. So so I just want to understand that, and also between the two of used by SLSA and used by like S2C2F, what's the differences, and is there like a documentation on those?
So actually, it's funny you bring that up. I don't know. Did you see the blog that came out this week?
No.
Okay, so Aditya, Tom, Tom's on this call, wrote a blog on Intodo and SLSA, and sort of where where trying to help folks better understand. The idea here is SLSA is a set of requirements, and then the SLSA provenance is a type of Intodo statement, or sorry, a type of Intodo predicate. Which is used in an Intodo statement. Tom, do you want to talk to that?
Yes. So right. So the thrust of the blog post is basically that SLSA provenance and SLSA VSAs are like just one, or are just two types of Intodo predicates, and that Intodo predicates and Intodo attestations can be used to express many more things about your software supply chain that you might care to track. This was not meant to say like these things cannot eventually be in the domain of SLSA. I know that SLSA has ideas on new tracks that cover other things, and I think that our hope on the Intodo attestation side is that the new data required to implement those tracks can be encoded in Intodo attestations.
All right, thanks. And then with the article, I'll review this conversation, the article, to get better understanding.
Yeah, and if anything after that is still like maybe not clear, feel free to provide that feedback, because obviously as we continue on, we're going to want to update documentation, create new blog articles and so on to make the distinction clear as well, which is like Intodo is a project that SLSA uses to provide that provenance as well as other things like the VSA.
Yeah, and of course that I know there was a discussion about SLSA versus S2C2F and about toolings. I guess that's going to be part of it.
Yep. But yeah, that was a good question. It's one that we got a lot, which is why Aditya and Tom wrote up that article. All right. Any other topics? Otherwise, I have a smaller thing. All right. So I know based on the last couple of weeks, some of our conversations, I wrote up a tool, open source tool for generating SLSA provenance as well as sort of doing a bunch of different things with SLSA provenance called Spectre. And there's some stuff in here which I'm hoping can, it's open source. So, and, depending on how things go, maybe we'll try and contribute it back to the OpenSSF if folks find interest in it. But there's some additional features that I added in there. And this is like as a reminder, this tool is not like a tool that's necessarily intended to be like, it's not a build tool directly. It's a it is a tool for helping sort of build the build tools and other things. Hasn't been an official release yet. It's all written in Rust, so for folks who know Rust and that kind of thing. But there's some stuff in here, if I kind of, and the UI UX stuff is still going to be worked on quite a bit. But as an example, I can do a couple of different things. I can generate a schema out of Intodo v1, right? I can generate JSON schema out of geez. One thing I will say is Rust can be quite slow to compile. So I can generate from the sort of structs within Rust here. Where did this go? Why is this not loading? There we go. I can have like an Intodo statement, can have a bunch of stuff in it. I can have, you know, provenance statement. I can have information about the predicates and all of this stuff. These are all structs in here using this Rust library that I'm using called, was it schema RS? It lets me sort of take those and generate JSON schema out of it. It's not obviously perfect, but it's actually pretty good. It'll generate all this. And then one of the things I can also do as well is go the other way. So I can do I think it's this. And then if I give it right, I can now generate Rust code out of the JSON schema as well. It's not exactly a one-to-one mapping, you know, where it's not rather I shouldn't say it's like it's not invertible exactly. It generates slightly different Rust and JSON schema as going in and going out. But I think the general thing here is one of the big, you know, questions that folks had is like, hey, is there stuff to help me kind of figure out how to implement the SLSA stuff a little bit easier? Is there stuff that can help me generate code for it? Is there stuff that can, like, I require a, you know, a JSON spec, or I require a you know, protobufs and so on and so forth. And I know that we have some official protobufs and we have a few, you know, some Q code and so on, but you know, the idea here is to have something like this be able to generate back and forth. You know, it could be SLSA today, it could do SBOMs tomorrow. It doesn't necessarily need to be tied directly into SLSA. But the idea here being making it super simple to sort of validate as well as validate. And I showed off the validation a bit last week, where I can go and take, you know, one of these documents, validate them, and then you know, it'll come back with, you know, yes, this is a valid SLSA document, or no, it's not a valid SLSA document. And it does, like, as I kind of brought up also last week, is it doesn't it has some semantic understanding of the types as well. So the idea would be, is this an actual hash of the right length and the right size and the right yada yada? You know, if not, hey, it's not a valid hash. Is this actually valid base64 encoded content? If it's not, like, you know, don't claim it's a valid SLSA document. And then eventually the idea would also be to it to be a verifier that can go out to the various URLs, verify that the content is correct or whatever, based on some of those things. So yeah, that's really about it. There's some, you know, feel free to, if folks are interested, it's all Apache licensed and everything else.
So I guess as like one of the Intodo attestation maintainers, I'm interested in where you see this going. Like we've recently been putting some effort into defining protobufs for the various in-toto predicates and like doing code generation for those things for Go and Java and like Python. And I like I guess like it would be nice if folks could like settle on sort of like one way to do it, but perhaps that's being overly optimistic.
Yeah, no, I hear you, and I think it's the thing, at least for the foreseeable future. I think what you're going to see is, because I know that there's also like plugins, for example, for protobufs that allow you to, let's say, introduce constraints into a protobuf beyond just like this is a string, that kind of thing. You can say like, well, this is a string that should be of length this that meets this regular expression or whatever. So I do think that on that end, I think at least in the short term, we just need to be relatively flexible while still telling folks like, look, this is the canonical way of doing it. We're going to provide some tools to help you out, because a lot of folks are going to come in and say, hey, all of my stuff uses JSON schema. So if you can't provide me a JSON schema, and you go, okay, great. Well, we can provide you a JSON schema, but we're going to tell you right now, it might not be as complete as this other thing. So you might need to do additional stuff on top.
Yeah, and like maybe really the important part is not like, is there a canonical way to define the layout, but rather, is there a canonical and authoritative validator so that I can say, regardless of how I'm generating this thing, if I pass it through this tool, it will tell me yes, it's good, or no, it's not, and then I'm free to sort of implement it however I wish.
Yeah, so that's definitely one of the goals of Spectre, and the reason why I chose Rust for it was specifically because of how, like, the thing I found was actually, if you look at a lot of the SBOM tools, I found that a lot of the SBOM tools are very loose in their validation, very loose in their generation, and a lot of it is, I don't want to say caused by, but it's impacted by languages that are either dynamically typed or languages that are more loosely typed than Rust, which is like very, very, very strictly typed, and lets you sort of encode very, very complicated sets of types and constraints and all that stuff. And so I found that like a lot of the SBOM tools, like when using like they were breaking, some of the stuff in Guac, for example. They were breaking our ingestion into Guac. And wait a second, hey, if I went and I looked at, like, if I took a Rust tool and said, hey, can you validate this? It said, no, you're missing this. Or, it's actually, this field is required. These other fields are all optional. Like there's lots of things in there that were required, optional, yada, yada, that were not getting caught by a lot of these other tools. So that's one of the reasons why I had picked Rust for that, was to say, I get a lot of these great compile time checks, which is also why some of it can be a bit slow to compile. But there's a lot in there. And in fact, actually, let me go and just share it just to kind of like, I don't want to turn this into a, oh, here's all the things I love about Rust, but like, if I go in and share this, if I go in and just kind of take, let's say, the in toto statement here, everything is using a package called Serde, which is it's serialization deserialization package for Rust, and I can just derive all of these different things from the structs as long as they are like basic types like strings and yada yada. And that serialization deserialization can be used to then just continue to serialize and deserialize other things. So like here I have something that's a subject, which is a list of, you get a list of subjects, and subjects themselves consist of a name and a digest set. And a digest set consists of these things. And as long as each of these things derives deserialize and serialize, it just automatically works. At the end, all of this stuff just kind of immediately works. And if there are certain things, for example, if I go into let's see, is it? And I realize that this resource descriptor should probably be in its own file, but the resource descriptor in here, you'll notice here, right? This is a base 64, like there is no default base 64 encoded deserialization thing. So I had to write my own. It turns out there might actually be one out there that I'll probably switch to, but here, hey, I can, have this content, which is turning into some bytes, as long as, it actually matches that, right? If somebody gives me a random string, in most cases, that random string would probably, like if I was using most other things, like that random string would have to be checked. You'd have to write a bunch of, logic somewhere in there to check at runtime, like, hey, when I pull this in, check, is this a base 64 encoded string? If not, throw an error, blah, blah, blah. Whereas here, it lets me kind of very easily keep all of this content right here. The other thing is, using tools like that. There's a tool called Typify, which I started using that's coming out of the Oxide folks that I integrated into this. I can generate, from a JSON schema into this. I can also potentially take protobufs, and I can turn them into Rust and so on. So the idea here would be you could, the first pass comes in here, and then, we'd still probably expect a human to come in and make it more rigorous. But that's kind of one of the, the reasons why I think I chose to do it this way was just how sort of, there's a bit of a learning curve, but once folks, for folks who know Rust, it's like, hey, okay, I see, this is a URL. So it uses the, URL serializer, deserializer. It, and it could sort of take care of all these things without having to do, for example, in Go, right, where you have to sort of, you get a lot of, you have to recursively deserialize all the different things. Whereas here, you can sort of just come in and say, here's the entire specification, and it'll just take care of the rest. Does that make sense? And then this, because I'm encoding some of the semantic information inside of the types, it lets me longer term make it also much easier to then eventually verify, right? Where I can now go in and say, great, I now have this base 64 encoded set of bytes. I can do something with it as part of a verification. I have a set of URLs that I know those URLs are actually valid URLs. I can now verify that those URLs are resolvable, that they get me what I need. Cool. Yeah, that was about it. And I think, the other thing just to kind of end it with is just, yeah, I think folks are asking for a lot more tools like something like Spectre, right? It could be in any language that, doesn't have to be this, but just this idea of, hey, how do I know, I'm trying to make a tool that implements SLSA 1.0. How do I know I'm doing the right thing? It has been a very open question for folks.
Yeah, 100%. And there's only there's only so much value that you can get from just looking at the JSON output and trying to see if it's doing everything right. So this is really nice to see.
Oh yeah, and one of the things I forgot to show, but I'll just talk about it is I also included a couple of other things in here as well that makes it much easier to verify where in the JSON also something has gone wrong. Because a lot of the tools I noticed kind of just tell you the first example of oh, you're missing a field here. This will actually go through and loop through and provides an ability to say, yeah, you're missing, these 5 fields as opposed to just, oh, you're missing this field and it short circuits. Because that to be clear, I get that in most cases you want to short circuit during serialization, deserialization, but in in the case of something like, hey, I'm generating salsa documents, I want to know like, oh, I don't want to just know that I'm missing this one field, update it, then it says, oh, you're also missing this other field. I want to know all the fields I'm missing or all the fields that are mismatched types. So there's a lot that needs to be done on the user experience and UI side, but the general gist of it is going to be, hey, here's a whole bunch of stuff. Here's how to, and also hopefully hold somebody's hand throughout the whole process so that as they kind of go through, oh, here are the fields that are missing. You're passing in a URL that, or it looks like a URL, but it's not actually a URL. And oh, cool, you know, do the 5 or 6 things that they need to do, fix it, and then, you know, it comes through and it's like, looks good, great. Now it's and then also have something like a verification system in here. So are you actually generating stuff that can then be consumed by people to actually, you know, verify stuff?
Yeah, I would like to make a stronger claim that if you create a law that says thou shall do this, then there has to be a tool that checks it, because otherwise this whole thing is meaningless. Well, that's a strong statement, but you know.
Yeah, and in fact, this is that reason is exactly why, like, the, you know, for folks who are familiar with Guac at all, the thing that we've been building with Guac, you know, Google, ourselves, Purdue University, City, the thing we very quickly realized was like a lot of the SBOMs we were ingesting and some of the salsa attestations we were ingesting into Guac weren't actually valid, right? Like they, you know, because in order for us to pull out all of that semantic value, we need to check the thou shall, you know, it's like, yes, if this is optional, it's optional. If it's required, it has to be there because we can't possibly key off of things that don't exist. And so we ran in, you know, we started running into all sorts of issues where we had to throw out, you know, we have to throw out these 5,000 SBOMs because they're not actually valid to the spec. They're close, they're 90% valid, but you know, they in particular, one of the common examples is it's very easy to trick one of the SBOM generators into giving you a hash that is not SHA-1. You could just tell it like, I want to use a SHA-256 hash. Great. But SPDX and I think Cyclone DX as well both require, at least right now, Salsa, the new versions don't, I think, require SHA-1 at least, and then you could have other ones in addition. But most SBOM generation tools, if you just said, I want SHA-256, it just went, great, I'm just going to give you only a SHA-256 when it needed to give you a SHA-1 plus a SHA-256. And I know that's like super pedantic, but like when your tools, when you're saying like, wait a second, no, I need to be compliant with the spec and I'm going to expect a SHA-1 everywhere because it's required. If it doesn't show up, you know, it leads to all sorts of issues, and it leads to you know, a lot of like heuristics and things that end up leading to a lot of the issues we see. Cool. Yeah, and I agree with that, Brendan. Yeah, if they can't get the syntax right, I also have concerns about getting the content right. And that was also something that, you know, for folks who aren't aware, there's a really good YouTube video that Ian Coldwater, Duffy, and a bunch of other folks put on. Where is this? KubeCon. Let me bring this up just because I think it's very valuable for folks who. It's called malicious compliance here, and this is one of the issues. Like when I mean, this is not totally related to this specific thing, but I think one of the things that came up is like, if you're doing only like if you're not being rigorous about a lot of things and you're just kind of looking at, you know, and this is, I think, something that helps out. Like this is one of the key use cases of Salsa here is like, if you can determine that the build process was okay, then you have increased confidence that by generating the SBOM that somebody has not messed with the container somewhere in the middle, right? And this talk, just the very quick summary is, they showed that if you mess with a container and do something like remove the package database. It doesn't fail closed, it just fails open. So it'll just be like, oh, I found no packages. Great. And you're like, oh, great. So now I have an SBOM that has nothing of value in there, even though it actually has all these packages with all these vulnerabilities. And then also doing small things like removing Etsy release file and some of these other things that are messing with a file here or there. And all of a sudden it can't detect the vulnerability anymore, even though the vulnerability is still there. And, you might say, well, you can't expect all these tools to know everything, but at the same time, you would expect those tools to be like, hey, this is weird. I'm expecting this thing to exist. It doesn't exist. I should probably say unknown or can't generate, something, instead of just sort of saying, oh, it's fine, I'm going to fail open. Yes, Brendan. Yeah, deleting the metadata from an image breaks the tool that builds metadata on the metadata. Yeah, that's and so I'm hoping like this is actually just the I can't state strongly enough how much I actually like that SLSA is here, because I've actually used SLSA for my SBOM generation in addition to the build, where I can say I built this container and ran the SBOM generation during this step, and here's like, I took it, I built this image with this, hash, and then I ran the SBOM on this image with this hash. So I know that the build process wasn't, compromised or whatever. Sorry, also the SBOM generation happened on the actual thing, and obviously we want to have SBOM generation happen and as early on in the process as possible, like off of the, you want to have, I know that they now have the SLSA SBOM types, which are something we need nowadays to keep track of, but like the idea of like, you could have an SBOM based on the, the dependencies manifest. You could have an SBOM that gets scanned afterwards and so on. And I think both are valuable just from what the first one is like, hey, what should be there? And the second one is what actually ended up there, is an interesting thing. Anyway, I don't want to rant any further. So for folks who'll be at Open Source Summit next week, I'll see you there. For folks who aren't going to be, I'll definitely, we'll collect a list of talks that we feel are valuable once they're uploaded on YouTube. And yeah, so next week we'll cancel this meeting because I have a feeling a few of us are going to be over there. Or we'll see if there's interest still for the meeting next week. We can have it. I just won't be there. I know Frederick, if you're available, you can facilitate. Anyway, otherwise, I'll see you in a couple weeks.